It's Friday, April 6th. I'm Elisa Escarce, and you're listening to Uptown Radio.
And I'm Eileen Grinch. The big guns of New York politics are descending on Westchester County ahead of a special election this month. The campaigns of both candidates are reacting to anti-Trump sentiment.
A strong triumph in her election will send a message to Washington that the politics of nastiness and divisiveness is over.
New bills before the City Council aim to crack down on sexual harassment by encouraging employees to speak up.
When men push back against sexist remarks, people tend to take that more seriously.
And the fatal crash of a helicopter tour into the East River led to calls to ban these flights. But one group, Stop the Chop, opposes aerial tours for reasons entirely unrelated to public safety.
The constant assault of noise, 6 days a week, hundreds of days a year.
All this and more on Uptown Radio. But first, the news.
California and headlines.
Live from NPR News in Washington, I'm Lakshmi Singh. U.S. stocks tumble over mounting concerns about trade. At one point, the Dow sank more than 700 points, or more than 3%, on news the tensions were escalating between the U.S. and China. President Trump is threatening to impose an additional $100 billion in tariffs on Chinese imports, and China says it is prepared to strike back more strongly if Trump follows through. But as NPR's Scott Horsley tells us, Trump's top economic advisor is downplaying the impact Trump's policies may be having on the health of the U.S. economy.
White House economic advisor Larry Kudlow told reporters today that President Trump's political fortunes will rise or fall on the strength of the U.S. economy. That is certainly a reasonable statement, but the timing is somewhat awkward, coming on a day when March job numbers came in well below expectations, and the stock market is tumbling over fears of a trade war with China that the president has ignited.
That's NPR's Scott Horsley. At last glance, the Dow is down 573, 2.3% at 23,932. The U.S. is imposing sanctions against 24 Russians, oligarchs, and government officials. The administration says they're hitting back at the government of Russian President Vladimir Putin for ongoing and increasingly brazen pattern of bad behavior, citing Crimea, Syria, cyber attacks, and last month's nerve agent attack in England. Here's White House Press Secretary Sarah Sanders.
As the president has said, he wants to have a good relationship with Russia, but that's going to depend on some of the actions by the Russians. However, at the same time, the president is going to continue to be tough until we see that change take place, and we're going to continue working forward in what we can to have that meeting and have a meeting with Vladimir Putin at some point.
That's Sanders addressing reporters in today's White House press briefing. Well, doctors in southern England who are treating a former Russian double agent exposed to a Soviet-era nerve agent say he is no longer in critical condition. NPR's Joanna Kakissis reports from London that his daughter, who was also poisoned, said in a statement that she is recovering after what she called a disorienting experience.
Doctors in the city of Salisbury, where Sergei Skripal lives, say the 66-year-old is, quote, improving rapidly after responding to treatment. It's not clear what the treatment is. Skripal was apparently exposed to a nerve agent called Novichok, which is usually deadly and causes long-term damage. Antidotes include a drug called atropine, which must be administered immediately. Skripal and his 33-year-old daughter, Yulia, have been hospitalized for more than a month after they were found slumped on a park bench. The UK blames Russia for the attack, but Russia says the UK is lying and that the Skripals were never exposed to a nerve agent. Joanna Kakissis, NPR News, London.
This is NPR News.
For Columbia Radio News, I'm Sarah Wyman. On WNYC's Brian Lehrer show this morning, Mayor Bill de Blasio continued to explain the city's response to the death of a mentally ill Crown Heights resident who was shot by police 2 days ago.
We're trying to focus on transparency. That's why the 911 transcripts are out. The video is out.
De Blasio has promised the shooting will be investigated by both the NYPD and the state attorney general. A New Jersey court has settled the last major lawsuit against the NYPD over a decade-long surveillance program that targeted Muslim Americans. The city will pay up to $22,500 to local Muslim businesses and organizations. Albert Fox Khan is the legal director of New York's Council on American Islamic Relations. He says the settlement's a step in the right direction, but the conversation is far from over.
The
settlement doesn't end a number of practices that continue to target Muslim Americans who have done nothing more than try to go to mosque or to pray or to simply go about their lives.
Foxconn wants the NYPD to do more to protect Muslim Americans from electronic and social media surveillance. New York attorneys have a new reason to worry their clients won't show up to court. Immigration and Customs Enforcement agents detained an undocumented immigrant this morning as he left his hearing at a Brooklyn courthouse. He was there to defend himself in a domestic violence case. Meanwhile, on Twitter, fans of Bronx-born rapper Cardi B are delighting over the release of her first album, Invasion of Privacy. Thanks to the massive sale numbers from her hit single Bodak Yellow, which was released in September, Cardi B's new album is already eligible for gold certification. Minor delays on the A, C, and E lines could delay your commute this afternoon, but the weather will cooperate with your travel plans this weekend. Forecasters are walking back their snow predictions, and skies should be clear with a high of 47 degrees. It's currently 55 degrees in Central Park. For Columbia Radio News, I'm Sarah Wyman.
This is Uptown Radio. I'm Eileen Grinch.
And I'm Elisa Escarce.
President Donald Trump has announced that he may be imposing additional tariffs on Chinese goods. This latest tit-for-tat over trade between the two nations comes after China responded to Trump's penalties on Chinese steel with retaliatory measures of their own.
I asked William Reinsch, senior advisor at the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington, D.C., if we're headed towards a trade war.
I think the risk of it happening increased significantly. Normally with these things, we do something, the other guy does something equivalent, we glare at each other for a while, and then there's a negotiation. The president's moved on to round two, which is unusual because the Chinese responded normally. They responded with an equivalent amount of retaliation. The president has responded to that with a more than equivalent amount of counter-retaliation. The Chinese will, without question, respond in some way, and that makes the situation much, much riskier.
And how might people who are listening to this, how might they notice this in their day-to-day lives?
If the tariffs are actually implemented, okay, big if. But if the tariffs are actually implemented, prices on cars will go up, prices on laptop computers will likely go up. On the other side, food prices may go down because the Chinese are retaliating against American farmers, which means that the farmers are going to be stuck with quantities of soybeans and other crops that they can't sell in China, which may mean the price here will drop.
And there's been a response in the financial market. Last night there was a drop. Could you talk a bit about what that response has looked like?
There's always the immediate reaction, which is almost always negative when there's some sudden development. And I think the real damage of what is being done is not via an overt war of tariffs. It's the fact that if you're a company or if you're an investor trying to figure out where you want to put your money, you don't know what the president's going to do next. And so in the face of not knowing, you sit on your money.
And so does that uncertainty have an impact in the real world?
I think it slows down or stops growth and investment that would otherwise occur. At sort of an emotional level, it makes everybody kind of cranky. Nobody knows what's going to happen next, and people are on edge about it because it's fine to come in and say, well, trade with China is only, some relatively small percentage of the U.S. economy. How bad can it be? But, if you're a farmer who suddenly isn't going to be selling any of your soybeans to China, this is a devastating blow.
All right. William Reinsch, Senior Advisor at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Thank you so much.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
2 seats in the New York State Senate have been vacant since January, and the special election to fill the positions is just a few weeks away. With majority control hanging in the balance, the spotlight is on Westchester County, where the race is especially tight.
Both candidates have received big-name endorsements, but they're appealing to voters in different ways. Jennifer Siegel reports.
When Julie Killian arrived at her Yonkers campaign office earlier this week, she was greeted by a small, enthusiastic group of supporters. But they weren't there just to see her. Standing next to Killian behind a small podium was a much more famous face.
I am proud this morning to endorse Julie Killian as the next state senator from Westchester County. We need change, and the right person to lead the charge to make that change is Julie Killian.
If you didn't recognize that voice, it was former New York Governor George Pataki. He's the last Republican to hold statewide office in New York. And Pataki's endorsement was clear. He thinks Albany would benefit from someone like Killian, an outsider like Killian.
She doesn't come from Albany. She's not part of the corrupt culture that has been there for far too long.
And the former Wright councilwoman has used this outsider status to appeal to voters, to differentiate herself from her opponent, Democrat and state assembly member Shelley Mayer.
We have legal corruption and illegal corruption, and the illegal corruption is bad enough, but the legal corruption may actually be worse.
Tying Mayer to corruption in Albany has been a key part of Killian's offensive. But Mayer, on the other hand, has been drawing on the anti-Trump sentiment among the district's Democrats. And to drive the message home, she brought in the big guns.
A strong triumph in her election will send a message to Washington that the politics of nastiness and divisiveness is over in America. So, please support Shelley.
On Wednesday afternoon, about 100 people showed up to hear Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer speak at Mayor's Mamaroneck campaign headquarters. His endorsement followed one from Governor Cuomo and another from Westchester County Executive George Latimer, who previously held the seat. In his campaign for county executive, Latimer used a similar strategy to the one Mayer is using now. When it was her turn to address the crowd on Wednesday, Mayer drove that message home.
This race is about values, the values of this district, and taking the Senate into a democratic, progressive tradition that it belongs and it has not had. We are going to change that on April 24th.
Whether or not that change will happen is still unclear. But what is clear? The Trump effect in this district. That's according to Jeannie Zino, a political science professor at Iona College and a senior advisor at Applied Techonomics. Last November, she did polling research on Westchester County ahead of a local election. About 2/3 of respondents who cared about taxes went with the Republican candidate, she says. And yet, that wasn't enough.
That wasn't enough to win the day when it came to battling the ghost of Donald Trump, if you will.
The Democrat won. Zino says in that race, more than anything else, voters were motivated by a desire to reject the president's politics.
It almost didn't matter who was running as a Democrat, just like it didn't matter who was running as a Republican.
Zino says anti-Trump sentiment is changing how politicians campaign, all the way down to the hyper-local level. And this election is no exception. But she says Killian's run a strong campaign, even though Mayer has the benefit of name recognition and anti-Republican sentiment.
Whether you're Republican or Democrat, these are two really, really good local politicians with a lot to offer. Looks like the Democrat will probably take it, but certainly the Republican is putting up a really good fight.
The special election will be held on April 24th. But with the midterms coming up later this year, whoever wins the seat will have to fight to keep it come November. Jennifer Siegel, Columbia Radio News.
Bill O'Reilly, Harvey Weinstein, Matt Lauer. Stories of sexual harassment in the workplace are everywhere.
In New York, the City Council hopes to address the issue head-on with a new set of laws that will affect every business in the city. Reporter Wendy Rhodes begins our story by asking New Yorkers about their experiences with harassment at work.
Yes, I've suffered sexual harassment at my workplace.
Yes. I have. No, I actually have not experienced it.
I've seen it and I've personally experienced it.
Me too. The hashtag heard round the world. People are speaking out more than ever these days against sexual harassment. And City Councilwoman Helen Rosenthal told me that New York City is listening.
Hi, it's Helen.
I'm really excited.
Me too.
Me too. Two of my favorite words.
That's a funny way to begin.
Rosenthal is the chair of the Committee on Women. She's pushing a package of 12 bills through the City Council that are aimed at reducing sexual harassment in the workplace. She addressed a packed room of legislators, activists, and business owners at the first public hearing on the bills in February.
We must take responsibility for crafting the most comprehensive, most survivor-centered,
and most holistic anti-sexual harassment policy and procedures in the country.
The bills require companies to display a poster explaining what sexual harassment is and how to report it anonymously. Businesses with 15 or more employees will be required to complete online training twice a year. Rosenthal said these laws are long overdue.
We've lost out as a society on so many good ideas, achievement, just because of sexual harassment in the workplace. We have to interrupt that.
All companies in New York City will be bound by the new rules. Companies like Serious Eats, a culinary website founded by Ed Levine in 2006. Levine says he's never really thought much about sexual harassment training.
It just has never come up. And I don't know whether it's because people aren't telling me that they've experienced it, or whether it just hasn't been an issue.
Levine says he tries to foster an environment where people can feel comfortable coming forward, but he admits that good intentions aren't always enough.
At worst, it's a pain in the ass for companies that don't need it. And at best, it offers a path to people being more sensitive to this whole issue.
Others say that people need to be more than just sensitive to the issue. Marianne Cooper is a sociologist at Stanford University and an expert on sexual harassment policy.
If you have a good sexual harassment policy in place and people really feel like they can come forward, you should expect an increase in complaints. And you shouldn't interpret it as a sign that, we're doing something wrong. What you really want is people to come forward.
Cooper says racial and ethnic minorities are at particularly high risk for sexual harassment, and that assertive, independent women in positions of authority are also at risk.
Sexual harassment becomes a way to knock women down a peg. Sex and power are closely connected.
To prevent sexual harassment, Cooper says that everyone needs to be on board.
When men push back against sexist remarks, for example, people tend to take that more seriously than when women do.
But Levine worries that city-required training might turn some men off.
It's a little bit like fire drills. They become obligations that people tune out. Oh, now we have to have a sexual harassment training day. But look, if it saves one woman from being sexually harassed, it's probably a good thing.
New York City's Commission on Human Rights will be tasked with handling complaints. The bills are expected to pass next Wednesday, but even so, Councilwoman Rosenthal says that the new laws are far from a solution.
Are they enough? Absolutely not.
Rosenthal says that the council will be proposing even stronger regulations to the city's sexual harassment laws at their meeting this June. Wendy Rhodes, Columbia Radio News.
A Long Island high school student and former MS-13 gang member who became an FBI informant was arrested and slated for deportation, despite the agency's promise of protection.
This morning, I spoke to Hector Silva, a journalist and fellow at the Center for Latin American and Latino Studies. I asked him about the options available for kids looking to leave gang life.
Listen, that's a complex question, and I think it goes to the core of what this phenomenon is about. MS-13 is a criminal organization that feeds mostly on crime, on extortion, on homicide, but at its core, it has a social nature. Its recruits are poor young men that precisely, going to your question, don't have a lot of chances or choices. They most likely live in fragmented families where domestic violence is an issue and it's a constant. So the gang feeds on that, preys upon that.
And so what has the law enforcement approach been to MS-13 up until now?
When the U.S. local law enforcement started dealing with this, they came to the conclusion that they need to have a mixed approach that had both the law enforcement component and the social component. There are very successful cases in which local governments, municipalities, county governments have dealt with MS-13. I know, especially, for instance, the Montgomery County experience in Maryland. The way they approached it was, again, by law enforcement, tough law enforcement. They built anti-gang units, used a lot of police intel to deal with this, make sure that they understood the phenomena, But also they put a lot of resources into schools. Schools are the place in which these kids go. It's the first institution that encounters them in the U.S.
Is this Henry case signaling any kind of change in national policy on how we deal with these communities?
Yes, I think it represents this approach in which, the most important thing for the authorities is to criminalize these youngsters. The case is not new. In the case of Henry, I think it's more evident that all that the U.S. authorities wanted was his testimony, and in order to get a conviction, and then they just got rid of him. And it goes again back to the vulnerability of these kids. Listen, these kids were not born assassins. They become members of this criminal organization because of the circumstances that surrounds them.
Hector Silva, journalist and fellow at the Center for Latin American and Latino Studies, thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure.
The NYPD is the target of a class action lawsuit after officers allegedly forced 2 Muslim women to remove their hijab while taking mugshots.
Advocates say that the lawsuit is an indicator of the lack of trust between Muslim women and the police. Juliette Jabkira reports.
Arwa Aziz was arrested in August 2017 over a domestic dispute with her sister-in-law. Charges were eventually dropped. But when she was taken to Brooklyn Central to be photographed, NYPD officers asked her to remove her hijab. She told them she couldn't. They said it was the law. So she did remove it, in tears.
It was so obvious that Miss Aziz was suffering that many of the male prisoners who were standing in the hallway while the photograph was being taken turned their backs in an effort to give her some basic modicum of privacy. But the NYPD did nothing of the kind.
Emma Freeman is one of the lawyers representing Aziz in the case. The class action lawsuit is seeking to change the NYPD policy of removing religious head covering for arrest mugshots. Freeman says for Muslim women, removing the hijab is more than just a matter of modesty.
It goes to the very core of who they are, how they conceptualize themselves, how they conceptualize their relationship to their faith, and their dignity.
If a woman feels as if she's going to be questioned about her faith or about her modesty, which is very central to her, that can be problematic. You feel as if you're being victimized.
That's Afaf Nasher, the executive director of the Council on American Islamic Relations in New York, also known as CARE. CARE is a civil rights advocacy group and are attorneys in the case. The lawsuit claims that forcing women to remove the hijab is anti-constitutional. But Nasher says that this kind of disrespect for the religion also contributes to mistrust toward the police among Muslim women.
For anyone at all who has had to deal with law enforcement in a way in which you're the one that's being questioned, it's already a harrowing experience. People are already fearful about it.
She says the hijab issue could cause reluctance of women to go to the police. Samia Al-Gahmi works at the An-Noor Social Center in Berridge, a Brooklyn neighborhood with a large Muslim population. She says the local precinct has been helpful in providing security against anti-Muslim hate crimes. But even so,
they think twice before calling the police if they needed help.
And like many women, sometimes Muslim women do need help. Shaida Rashid is a social worker with Saki for Sasajan Women, an advocacy group fighting domestic violence. She says that Muslim women are particularly vulnerable because many in the community are first-generation immigrants. Rashid told Uptown Radio over the phone there are 2 main obstacles making it harder for women to report domestic violence. One is the language barrier, and the other is culture.
When the victims shared their physical, emotional violence issue with their family members, often, people started counseling them to make them understand that if you report it to anyone, then, it will be trouble for you, it will be trouble for your children, and it will put your family down.
Rashid says that for Muslim women to trust the police, the NYPD needs to show they understand their cultural background. That's one thing the class action lawsuit is trying to achieve by shutting down the hijab removal policy. The NYPD didn't get back to repeated requests for comment. New York City has until April 10 to file its answer to the lawsuit. Juliette Jabkiro, Columbia Radio News.
And now a piece from our commentary series, where our reporters reflect on their own personal stories.
You wouldn't guess it, but a polo pony has a lot to teach a journalist. Reporter Kasiana McLenahan learned how skill and creativity can transform even the most stubborn horse.
I met Martini when I took her to see the dentist. Martini is a horse. She's small and stocky. She looks like a real-life version of the statues at P.F. Chang's. At the barn where the dentist had set up shop, Martini refused to open her mouth. She shook her big black head back and forth like a stubborn child. After a few failed attempts, the dentist gave up and stuck her with a powerful sedative. It was as though he'd given her a bottle of gin. On the way back to the pasture, a very drunk Martini walked slowly, swaying side to side, tripping over her own feet. I've been riding horses since high school. I went to boarding school in Southern California at a place steeped in rugged Western values. Its founder insisted that all students learn to ride a horse. I loved it, and stumbled into polo in college as a way to continue to ride. We played on a string of horses named after, what else, cocktails. In arena polo, teams of 3 riders try to whack a miniature soccer ball into a 10-foot goal with the wide side of a cigar-shaped mallet. My dental experience with Martini proved prophetic. Even when sober, she was clumsy and slow. In games, the line of horses would go galloping by, and only after much kicking would Martini and I dutifully take up the rear. We assigned horses to riders based on skill, so it wasn't until late spring that on some fluke, our best rider was assigned to ride Martini. I watched from the stands as the teams lined up and the referee threw the ball in, expecting to see Martini take up her well-worn place in the back. But then this tiny rocket leapt out of the pack and Martini's rider dribbled the ball down the arena on a breakaway to score. Over the next 7 minutes, the horse I had known from months of plodding practices transformed into an entirely different animal. And I learned that the skill of a horse has a lot to do with the skill of its rider. This was the first of many Martini moments. I eventually graduated from college and spent 6 years working in startups in Silicon Valley. But as much as I enjoyed my job, I found myself looking for a mission that went beyond designing new tech gadgets. So 2 years ago, I moved across the country to go to journalism school in New York. My first fall here, I was assigned a story about the upcoming 2016 election. The country was abuzz with the contest between Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton, and my professor wanted us writing about local elections, that famed domain of dog catchers and pothole complaints. At first, I despaired. But then, after some digging, I discovered that there hadn't been an open Democratic primary in my Upper West Side Assembly District since 1977. Suddenly, I had an interesting story. Like writing Martini, I've learned that reporting great stories has as much to do with the ingenuity of the journalist as the inherent greatness of the topic. Now, whenever I get that sinking feeling that I've been assigned a story without obvious appeal, I think about that rider and how to make a plodding old horse fly.
Kasiana McLenahan wants her radio editors to know that all the stories they've assigned her have been great to begin with. You're listening to Uptown Radio.
There's more to come. Stay with us.
Welcome back to Uptown Radio. I'm Eileen Grench.
And I'm Elisa Escarce.
Coming up this half hour, Colin Marston reports from Crown Heights, where the shooting of Saheed Vazel has sparked outrage about how police treat people with mental illnesses.
And are FEMA's new flood maps of New York City leaving people at risk?
These stories and more. But first, the news.
For Columbia Radio News, I'm Jennifer Siegel. The Nasdaq and Dow closed down a little over 2% after a rough day on the markets. Weaker than expected jobs numbers and concerns over a brewing trade war between the U.S. and China were contributing factors. President Trump isn't backing down from his proposal to increase tariffs on Chinese imports. Speaking to WABC TV this morning, Trump defended his stance.
We don't have a trade war. We've lost a trade war. The easiest thing for me to do would be just to close my eyes and forget it. If I did that, I'm not doing my job.
This afternoon, White House Press Secretary Sarah Huckabee Sanders defended the president's decision, placing the blame on China.
China created this problem, and the president is trying to put pressure on them to fix it and to take back some of the terrible actions that they've had over the last several decades.
Sanders was also asked about reports that the president's chief of staff, John Kelly, is urging Trump to fire the head of the Environmental Protection Agency, Scott Pruitt. Sanders did not answer. The EPA chief has been accused of ethics violations and controversial spending decisions. Russia got hit with a new round of U.S. sanctions today. The Treasury Department announced sanctions against 24 individuals. They include billionaire businessmen with ties to Putin as well as government officials. They come as special counsel Robert Mueller is continuing an investigation into possible collusion between Russia and the Trump administration during the 2016 presidential election. Ford Motor Company is recalling 350,000 Ford F-150s. The recall includes pickup trucks and SUV models. It came after the company received a report of an accident related to a faulty gear shift. It's 56 degrees and sunny in Manhattan, and it'll be rainy and around 45 degrees tomorrow, but no snow. Showers are expected later tonight. Most MTA subway lines are running with good service. Slight delays are being reported on the ACE, BDFM, and G lines. Jennifer Siegel, Columbia Radio News.
Last night, thousands of New Yorkers took to the streets to condemn the killing of 34-year-old Saheed Vazel. Vazel, a longtime neighborhood resident, was unarmed when police shot him 9 times. Officers mistook the pipe in his hand for a gun.
He had bipolar disorder, and critics say this illustrates the department's continued abuse of lethal force. Colin Marston reports.
Forever Saheed!
Forever Saheed. That's what the crowd of protesters gathered at Utica Avenue are chanting. It's Thursday night and the atmosphere is tense. This is the intersection where Saheed Vazel was shot and killed by police. Betty Key was a neighbor of Vazel.
I saw him after they shot him, and his body was curled up like a pretzel. And then after they shot him up, they put handcuffs on a dead man.
Key says she wants changes in the way police treat community members.
Please, enough. That's my word today, enough.
Vazel's death has garnered international media attention, and he has become the 294th person to be shot by police this year. Mayor de Blasio spoke this morning on WNYC. He says the city needs to be doing a better job connecting law enforcement with mental health providers.
There's going to be a full independent investigation by the Attorney General of the state, who I have a lot of faith in, and there obviously will be an NYPD investigation as well. This individual had a severe mental health problem that had gone untreated for quite a while. I'd like to see us stop that way, way earlier.
I mean, I think we can learn from this terrible tragedy that we need people other than the police responding.
Carla Rabinowitz is with Community Access, a nonprofit that advocates for people with mental health issues.
The police are doing command and control, meaning they come in and they take control of the scene, and if they see anything that looks like a gun, they just start shooting. That's not helping.
Rabinowitz says police aren't normally trained in de-escalation tactics, and when making split-second decisions, things can go easily awry. James Mulvaney teaches community policing and use of force at John Jay College of Criminal Justice.
The truth is, these things happen very, very fast. Time is the best solution to any conflict. But see something that looks to be presenting a danger to someone, you have to make a snap decision. In this case, appears to be wrong. With a improperly trained, it's too early to tell.
The NYPD hasn't released the names of the officers involved, but Rabinowitz says the problem doesn't lie with individual cops, but how the department responds to the mentally disturbed, referred to as EDP or emotionally distressed persons.
The police culture in EDP is like the lowest of the low. And they think anybody who is taking mental health medication is a second-class citizen. But it shouldn't take a death for the mayor to act. There's been too many deaths.
Community health advocates like Rabinowitz are pushing for a revival of a 2014 task force that looked at how behavioral health and criminal justice intersected. They want more police officers to go through de-escalation training and for more social workers to respond to 911 calls instead of cops. But in Crown Heights, there's a feeling of a deeper problem.
We've been marching for years, and we're still asking for the same thing. That let me know something is wrong. We demand the laws to be changed.
Mayor de Blasio says all patrol officers will be outfitted with body cameras by the end of the year. The NYPD could not be reached for comment. Colin Marston, Columbia Radio News.
FEMA is creating new flood maps for New York City. Those are the maps that determine which homeowners are required to buy flood insurance. The move is a response to Hurricane Sandy and pressure from the mayor's office.
But critics are concerned they won't give the whole picture of which New Yorkers will be at risk in the next storm. Mira Gable reports.
It's raining in Canarsie, Brooklyn, but not like it was during Hurricane Sandy. That was the last time Charlotte Engel was able to use the gold Nissan Maxima she had just bought.
My car was on the street, was flooded completely. FEMA came, I called FEMA, I had damage. They said it's not sufficient. I got a letter, not sufficient.
After the storm, her car wouldn't start and FEMA wouldn't pay for it. And there are many New Yorkers like her who had property damage. Largely because at the time, flood maps didn't include hundreds of homes. The last time they were updated was 1983, so more recent homeowners didn't know they had to buy insurance. But FEMA has just begun to collect data for new flood insurance maps that will tell residents whether or not they are living in a high-risk flooding zone. The agency is sending out crews to analyze topography along coastlines. Are there trees, marshland? Is there sedimentary rock, which is durable, or is there sandstone, which is more susceptible to flooding? Tom Santos is a flood expert at the American Insurance Association. He has concerns about the new maps.
There's often considerable delay in new mapping and how often they get updated.
That means new homes are often built in the time frame between data collection and map release.
But of course, there are people who are not mapped into those areas who still have a flood risk. And in that instance, it's really critical for towns, for communities, for cities, for property owners to be much more vigilant in their assessment of their own risks.
Santos says it's not that the science behind flood mapping is bad. It's just that it's slow. Matt Campos is a research specialist at Rutgers University. He says the maps pose two big problems. First, they only include homes, not roads or parks. So even if your home isn't considered to be in a high-risk zone, the road outside where your car is parked, like Engel's was, might be.
So we often advise communities to think about different types of floods and the ways that those impact different types of infrastructure systems and different types of people and different types of ecological assets in their communities.
Then he says there's climate change. FEMA's maps can't predict future risk. They can only predict risk the moment when the data is being collected. This leaves out unpredictable variables like rising seas. But Andrew Martin, chief of FEMA's risk analysis branch, says they will be helpful.
We've estimated around 6 million people from the southern tip of Cape May County, New Jersey, up to Westchester County will be directly impacted by this new analysis.
But even with the new maps, Martin says, the majority of the 8.5 million people living in New York City don't understand flood maps or whether they're at risk. Residents like Engel and her husband who own their home and don't pay mortgage aren't required to buy flood insurance. And even after Hurricane Sandy, they still don't have it. And they have no plans to leave.
Where am I going to go? At my age, starting with new mortgages? No, I'm staying.
Do you think with days like this or approaching storms, are you scared for another big storm?
No. No.
You're a fearless lady.
No, I'm not scared. I'm staying.
FEMA says its updated maps will come out in December of next year. Mira Gable, Columbia Radio News.
The helicopter crash that killed all 5 of its passengers earlier this month led to calls for a ban on helicopter tourism.
But there's one group that's been demanding this for years, not just because helicopters are dangerous, but because the flights diminish New Yorkers' quality of life. Reporter Bo Hamby has more.
That's the sound of a helicopter flying over the Hudson, and it drives Adrian Benepe crazy.
The constant assault of noise from early in the morning to sunset 6 days a week hundreds of days a year.
Benepe is a former New York City Parks Commissioner. He's currently working with Stop the Chop, a community group that's trying to ban all helicopter tourism in New York and New Jersey. Their argument? Helicopters are air polluters, and they're disturbing the few places you can find peace and quiet in the city.
It used to be that you could go out on the piers in Hudson River Park and get out to the end of an 800-foot pier and get away from the noise of the city. Now you leave the noise of the West Side Highway behind you and you run right into the helicopter highway.
That heli highway runs up and down the Hudson River. That's because tourist helicopters aren't allowed to fly over the city or the East River. And all of the flights take off and land at the downtown Manhattan heliport next to the Staten Island ferry. That's where the sound is most concentrated. And it's pretty loud down there.
I think the noise pollution is probably a really significant problem, no question about it.
Holger Eisel is a professor at Queens College studying air quality in New York City. He says that constant noise from choppers can lead to a variety of problems, everything from higher blood pressure to delayed development in children. And Eisel is also concerned about health effects from exposure to helicopter exhaust. He says it's like living close to a busy highway, which can lead to
certain types of cardiovascular diseases, pulmonary diseases, people who have asthma symptoms, they may have increased levels of asthma attacks.
Does it ever make you nervous watching them land?
Me? No.
That's Deputy Director of the Helicopter Tourism and Jobs Council, Sam Goldstein. He's watching a tour land before stepping away from the noise and into an office on the heliport. And he says the flights are a big part of the city's tourism industry.
People come to New York and they want this as an experience. They're coming to Lower Manhattan. They're going to businesses. They're riding the subways. They're putting money into the tax revenue stream.
And he says trying to stop the flights is misguided because people aren't calling to complain about the tours. They're calling about NYPD or news choppers.
What people are hearing when they complain about helicopters in the sky are almost exclusively not helicopter tours.
The police and news choppers are allowed to hover overhead. And according to 311 data, most people are calling to complain about helicopter noise when the tourist flights aren't supposed to be in the sky. Other limitations were put on heli tours when an agreement was struck with the operators to reduce the number of flights by half. That was 2 years ago, and in order to make sure the companies complied, they were required to provide the city with monthly reports on the number of flights conducted. But Adrian Benepe isn't convinced the companies are following through.
There's no one minding this. There's no one keeping an eye on how many flights. It's completely on the honor system.
Recently, the community board that represents the area around the heliport asked for those monthly reports, but they haven't heard from the agency that has them. Uptown Radio also asked for the documents, but did not hear back either. On April 19th, that same community board will hold a forum where the public and helicopter operators will have a chance to give their perspectives. The community board said in an email, quote, "That's a start." Bo Hamby, Columbia Radio News.
And now we close the show with a piece from our commentary series.
Reporter Sarah Wyman reflects on self-care, adulthood, and the roommate she didn't know she had.
When I moved to New York City from California last year, it felt like a pretty grown-up thing to do. I was 22. I'd never lived far away from home for more than a couple of months, and for most of undergrad, my parents, and more importantly, my dog, were only a few hours' drive away. So when I packed my belongings into exactly 2 tattered suitcases, each under 25 pounds, and moved them into an 8-foot by 8-foot box-shaped bedroom on the Upper West Side, I felt pretty darn cosmopolitan. And for the first couple of months, I held it together. I paid rent, taught myself how to jaywalk, and prepared pasta-based meals for myself, all while calling my mom a totally normal number of times per week. But all it took to unravel the facade of my newfound independence was a cockroach. To be fair, I'd had a rough couple of weeks. One of my roommates had threatened to kill herself a few days before. Everyone else was out of town, so I was the one who calmed her down and walked her to the emergency room. A few days later, I caught the flu. quarantined in my room with a 103-degree fever and a half-eaten pack of saltine crackers, I started to seriously question my ability to take care of myself without the help of my parents. And then, as all of this was coming to a head, I learned I was sharing my bedroom with a cockroach the size of a ceramic mug opening. I know this because I succeeded in trapping it before I totally lost all of my composure. It only just fit within the rim. Its spindly brown legs and squirmy antennae were poking out from inside. At the time, the cockroach felt like a manifestation of all the problems I was dealing with. I was in over my head, with life and the cockroach, and while I knew the grown-up and responsible thing to do would be to get the cockroach and flush it down the toilet, I was petrified by the idea of going anywhere near it. From across the room, I could hear it making a rustling sound, the sort of gross, pitter-pattering noise that only tiny legs can make on a linoleum floor. So I called my mom, piled a stack of books on top of the mug, and stared at it until the morning, when I texted a friend and she got rid of it for me. My roommate is doing better now, but we, like many of our peers, are living in a sort of middle ground of adulthood. I've moved away from home, I'm trying to support myself financially, and in many ways function the way an adult should. But I don't feel like an adult yet. When I was a kid, I think I was expecting to wake up the day after my 18th birthday and have suddenly acquired all of the traits that make people like my parents seem so responsible. I imagined myself rolling out of bed in a well-ironed suit, ready to take important phone calls, drive myself to work, and solve all of my own problems. But in my 10 months of experimental adulthood, I've discovered that growing up isn't a solitary experience. Part of being an adult, maybe even the most important part, is being able to recognize when you need help and being brave enough to ask for it. Luckily, in New York City, I'll always have cockroaches to remind me of that.
A week later, Sarah discovered a rat living under her kitchen stove, and like a real adult, she let an exterminator deal with it.
That's our show for today. We hope you enjoyed this edition of Uptown Radio.
Our executive producer today was Stevie Hertz. Our senior producer was Cassiana McLanigan. And our senior editor was Dan Rabb.
Augusta Anthony directed the studio team with help from producers Madeline Thompson, Bo Hamby, and Juliette Jepkiro. This stream made it live to the web thanks to Wendy Rhodes.
And a special thank you to our radio pros behind the scenes. That's Sally Herships, Deb Amos, Gilda DiCarli, and Ben Shapiro, with support from Carrie Donahue. I'm Elisa Escarce.
And I'm Eileen Grinch. Uptown Radio will be back next Friday, live at 4 p.m. Until then, you can find us at uptownradio.org. Thanks for listening.